overwintering birds, but also for waders. So I shall just share my screen. So so Rutland Water Nature Reserve in the East Midlands. It's at one end of Rutland Water, which is a triple SI, an SPA, and protected under the Ramsar Convention. So particularly important for its overwintering wildfowl. Up to over 20,000 wildfowl present in the winter. Which could be another talk for another day, but yeah, a really fantastic reserve. And we've got lagoons, some older lagoons which were built in the 1970s, and also some new lagoons which are about 12 years old, which you can sometimes find some amazing things in, which I might be talking about later as well. So bear with me. So here's a habitats map of Rutland Water Nature Reserve. So the reserve is about 1,000 acres, so 450 hectares, something like that. And it's got an amazing variety of habitats. So we're lucky to still have some amazing meadows and woodland, etc., which I'll be talking through as I go through. But in this particular thing, for the habitats for the waders, in this sort of turquoisey blue, these are our open water areas which are relatively shallow. So these have potential for breeding waders. And here is an aerial shot of not all of the reserve, but a lot of the reserve. And you can see these snaking islands on lagoons 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 there, and the older lagoons. Now, these snaking islands are great for breeding waders, and that's why, one of the reasons they were constructed that way. And we can actually manage them by getting onto them with machinery as well, which is a really brilliant design back in 12 years ago. And actually, when this photo was taken, you can see some of the lagoons are still under construction. So the variety of habitats we have on the reserve, the open water, which you see here, this is actually lagoon 3. They're relatively shallow, so you've got potential there for diving ducks to dive down and get weed to feed on, and that's what a lot of our birds are coming in for in the winter. And they're coming in from Northern Europe, from the north of the UK, and overwintering. And that's, as I say, that's the triple SI importance for the reserve, for its overwintering birds. But it's a brilliant reserve for so many things, other things. We have a variety of wetland habitats. So we've got pools. See a reedy pool on the left there. You've got wet ditches, which are fantastic for species like dragonflies, water voles, really interesting aquatic inverts and vegetation as well, and reed bed bottom left. So we've got we've got really great numbers of water rails. Been a survey just recently. We've so many more water rails overwintering than we ever thought. We've got we've got about 40 water rails calling back from the sort of tape lures, you call it, and they call back to you. So really amazing habitat for reed buntings, reed warblers breeding. We get wintering bittern in there. So yeah, the reed bed habitat is fabulous for biodiversity and just a great spread of species. Also, these shallow wet pools, bottom right, which we'll talk about a bit more later on as an importance for important habitat for breeding waders. We're also fortunate that we've got some amazing wildflower meadows. These wildflower meadows are we've got some very old wildflower meadows, but we're also creating new ones. This one is Sharples Meadow next to Lagoon 4, which we sowed about 8 years ago, and it's doing really well. Great butterfly use, great invert use, and this was a fairly innocuous bit of of semi-improved grassland, which we actually sprayed off, reseeded, and carefully weeded it for quite a few years. And the money was given to us by a gentleman called Dr. Sharple, and he wanted to see this meadow created as a legacy. He's unfortunately no longer with us, but a really fantastic way of us improving the biodiversity on site, creating great nectar sources and the like. Also on site, we've got a fair bit of rough grassland. Now that sounds awful, doesn't it? Rough grassland. It just sounds not particularly great habitat, but actually raft grassland is brilliant for invertebrates. It's great for grasshoppers, and also really great for voles. That long tussocky grass there. Field voles and the like can live in those tussocks and have this sort of web of tunnels underneath, and in turn they're a favorite food source of barn owls, which we have on site, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. In between many of the lagoons, we're fortunate to have scrub. Again, scrub has sort of funny connotations, but doesn't sound great again as well as a habitat. But scrub is an amazing place for so many different species. It's a really dynamic habitat. It needs managing quite heavily, but we've got nightingales in the scrub, blackcap, willow warblers, and they're all feeding on invertebrates. And the bird life, the bird species are there because of the invertebrates, and that's a really good indicator of how healthy a habitat is. So we do a lot of work on the reserve to maintain a good scrubby balance on the site. And species like nightingales really enjoy a rotation that when it gets to about 7 to 11 years old of scrub. So we try and manage our scrub that we've got scrub, but coming into the maturity from the aspect of the nightingales for that 7th year. So it's a real fine balance. We've got beautiful ponds. Here is a pond behind Lagoon 3 that's got great crested newts in. Again, we sort of manage the ponds to make sure that that they've not got trees all the way around, so you've got lots of light getting in for photosynthesis. Also, there'll be some log piles near it for great crested newts to overwinter in, and smooth newts as well. And but you don't want it just to be completely open and barren all the way around, because these species will be coming in and out, and they like some cover. So as you can see in the back of the pond there's a nice bit of cover for species to come in and out of and crawl in and out of, and a bit of shade as well. It's getting the right mix, but not overly shaded, where you get too much leaf litter falling into the pond. You get no photosynthesis happening, so you don't have aquatic vegetation doing very well at all. So those species, such as the great crested newts, need to fold the leaves, feed on the invertebrates. So having a nice diverse pond is really important. And we've got dozens of ponds on the nature reserve. The woodland on the reserve is really mixed as well. A lot of it was planted when the reservoir was constructed in the 1970s. So we've got plantation woodland, which bottom right you can see we've done some work there thinning the woodland. So that means removing the trees so you get sunlight into the bottom of the woodland, and that really regenerates and reinvigorates and creates a nice shrubby layer for different species to move into and to utilize. And that sun getting into the woodland floor is really important. You've got a bit of hazel coppice there. We've got hazel coppice at Hambleton Wood, as well as the bluebells there, which is Hambleton in the spring, April time is just an absolute dream. So, do make sure you go up there if you don't know it very well. We also not only do we have the sort of the classic habitats such as woodland and the like, but we also try and really make sure that we can create some man-made opportunities for species to flourish at Rutland Water as well. And we very lucky in a fairly new habitat and a fairly new site, such as, although it's the 1970s, we can try new things. So here we've got shelduck boxes. So here we've got a couple of trainees back in the day. Abby's not a trainee anymore, but trainees at the time putting in shelduck boxes. So these are little tunnels which you can see with a chamber in the back and a lid on the top, and the shelduck will go into there and nest. So they nest in rabbit holes and the like, and we're just mimicking something along those lines for them. So we've got a dozen of these across the site, and we do try and provide lots of different types of man-made opportunities. Here we've got a term raft. We call them term rafts, but very often they're really well utilised by common gulls, by black-headed gulls as well. And these are floating islands, and we cover them with gravel and also put a predator skirt around them as well. So these are actually pontoons like you get on a jetty. So you would you know you would have it in a sort of a marina or something similar to that, and we bolt them together and put a perspex predator skirt to stop otters jumping on and eating the chicks. And we'll refresh the gravel, but you can see the gull chicks in the bottom left, how the eggs look similar-ish to gravel, and that's why they're really attracted to it. So predators, when they fly over, don't see the eggs as well because of the gravel. So common terns are summer visitors. So they're just coming for spring, summer, and early autumn months, and breeding in these areas. And they did breed on the lagoons as well. So they don't just use these floating rafts. We're always looking for funding for these sorts of rafts. We were really fortunate that we had a gift to us to create 2 last year, but these come in at about £5,000 each, so they really are quite expensive. Yeah, we keep an eye out for funding for any more of those. But interestingly, I had an email a couple of days ago from a guy in Croatia who was interested in how we make these, and so I sent him some pictures and designs and the like. So yeah, they're quite innovative in the way we're doing those at the moment. We also have artificial sand martin banks, and we've got 2. And again, summer visitor that comes into the reserve, the sand martins, one of our earliest returning migrants. So sand martins are usually, well, they can get them all the way 6th of March, maybe sometimes. So not that long away, really. We'll be expecting them to return. So these are overwintering in Africa and flying all the way back. These are tiny birds, and they nest in sandy chambers in these artificial banks. And here's Tim on top right. Pick a nice cold day to clean the nest banks out. We try to anyway, so you can see the snow on the top left one. The reason we try and pick a cold day is that there is quite a few sand martin fleas in these when we clean them out, and there's hundreds of chambers to clean out. So if you look at the top left picture, you can see these little open hatches now with a bit of carpet on the back. So each of these chambers is cleaned out in the winter and some fresh sand put in the front, and the sand martins will use these. And we have over 1,000 sand martin chicks fledge every year, and often ring them as well. So we can go in and ring them, and that's how we know how many are successful. But they're really brilliant. And we ring, I think it was something along about 40% of the UK sand martins, something like that, Rutland Water. So absolutely spectacular results from these banks, and they're made out of breeze blocks, and they're sitting near the water's edge, and the sand martins just treat them as a sandbank that you might find on a river edge. And these have been going for years and just tremendously successful. Also, barn owl boxes. So barn owls utilize this across the site, this rough grassland I was talking about earlier on, and we put up all sorts of different boxes and check them. And you see that, as we can see at the bottom right there, that chick has been rung. So yeah, very successful across the reserve. So there's a little bit of a synopsis of what we about Rutland Water Nature Reserve, and what I want to get onto now is the key subject really. So the waders that use the site, and particularly the breeding waders. So what are waders? Well, sure, a lot of you will know a wader. Some people find identification of waders quite tricky, and I can see that, you know, why that's easily the case. But well, you can see it up on the screen there. They're long-legged birds that wade in the water and that search for food. So that's really the sort of the family group. And at Rutland Water, we have mainly 5 types of wader that breed on the reserve. So we've got redshank, which is in the middle there. Redshank, red legs, redshank, that's where the name comes from. Lapwings, you know, used to be commonly seen on all farmland breeding, but not so much anymore. That's the top middle there with that beautiful little crest. And little ring plovers there. So little ring plovers are, gosh, probably only a similar size to a sort of robin, really. They're not much bigger than that, nesting on the reserve. And they've got you can tell a little ring plover compared to a ring plover by the yellow eye ring. The oyster catcher, a black and white bird with a carrot in its nose, as I think I used to tell my kids when they were young. So yeah, they're our main breeding birds with the avocet top right. So avocets have only bred on the reserve in the sort of last 5 or 6 years, and particularly this year with some of the work we did on Lagoon 4, which I'll be talking about later. So what do waders need to breed? So water is one of the main elements, and that's why Rutland Water is so important. So most waders require open ground, really. They don't like there to be too much cover around them. Some, the likes of redshank, will need tussocky wet grassland. Little ring plovers like open ground with some gravel. Lapwings like open ground. That's where they sort of enjoyed the arable fields in the past. And then avocets like open ground, and oystercatchers like tussocky areas with gravel as well. So there's a real sort of mix there. But what we try and do on the reserve is make sure there's a bit of everything. So they're also territorial. So, you know, you can hear them. They'll be displaying at each other. So when we do surveys, we'll talk about a little bit more. You can do walkthrough surveys or observe as well. The other thing they need is obviously food. So they'll be eating invertebrates, little crustaceans, and worms. So we do water level control for them as well. And wherever possible, low predator pressure. And some, like little ring plovers, have specific sort of requirements of slightly gravelly areas to hide their chicks in. So how do we know what we've got breeding? So we do breeding wader surveys. So Sarah Bedford and Tim Sexton at work run these, and with some able and willing volunteers. So we are literally looking at all of the lagoons and monitoring them. So here you've got a map of Lagoon 4. We've numbered all the island numbers. So when the and actually they're actually on the islands as well. They're a big breeze block with a number painted on them. So when the volunteers go out, they can say, "Hang on a minute, you know, we've got a lapwing that looks like it's sort of nest scraping in Island 10," and that will get recorded on the sheet. Sorry, I just got a message. And so our We record the species, the island number, as I say, whether we're seeing any courtship, whether there's any copulation, so whether there's any mating going on, the nest scraping, and then whether we can see them incubating the chicks, and also when that's successful, when they're brooding the chicks, so they've got them, they'll especially when predators go over, they'll put their wings out and protect the young, sometimes from inclement weather, but often when there's a predator going on. And we also try and record predation events, because waders produce a lot of chicks, and they do get they do get predated, unfortunately. So what were our results like? Well, we've been doing wader surveys for a few years, recorded in this way, and unfortunately, COVID had a bit of an impact on our records. So I'm just going to give you the records for 2021, and we'll be doing similar again next year. So 2021 was a really good year for us, primarily because we did quite a lot of habitat management work. Now, waders, as I mentioned earlier on, are a species that like it to be really open, and they often like really disturbed and fresh habitat. So when you do some work, you can often see this real spike, this real improvement in species use and success of the lagoons. Also, as well as that, when we've done the work, you can see that sometimes it falls away a bit. However, if we keep and maintain those numbers, it can be really beneficial, because waders mob predators as they come past, and they push predators away. So if we can maintain those numbers, it's brilliant. So as you can see here, we had 30 fledged avocets, mainly on Lagoon 4, 19 fledged lapwing, 2 liver-ringed plover, 12 oystercatcher, and 7 redshank, which is very good for us, and we'll see if we can maintain that. We've got water levels quite high at the moment, so we'll try and maintain the sort of muddy openness by keeping it flooded. Most grasses and the like die off after about 10 weeks, so we try and keep our water levels up to make sure we've got enough muddy edge for 10 weeks through the winter. So how do we control our water levels to do that? The sluice you can see middle top there is one of the water control structures we've got. So in many of the lagoons, we can pump in and then we can let water out. So we've got the gauge boards, which you can see on the left, the picture there, and also the graph there is generally how we will maintain the water level. So we'll drop them through the spring, so we leave nice muddy edge for the wader chicks, and then we'll bring them up again in November, December. We try not to bring them up that quickly. That probably is a little bit extreme, because if we bring the water levels up too quickly, it often means that our wintering wildfowl, which are equally as important as the breeding waders, can't access the food if the water level comes up too quickly. So we try not to have the water levels coming up really, really quickly for that reason. Now, there's some really big challenges with breeding waders, and one of the big challenges is predation. So here is a not small number of our issues here, all beautiful, amazing creatures in their own right, but they do eat wader chicks and wader eggs. So just going around here, I'm sure a lot of you will know all these species, but we've got badgers. Now, badgers have been known to swim onto our lagoons and eat chicks, and also other terrestrial predators like stoats and foxes. Foxes are particularly tricky, because they will cross the muddy shallows and they very quickly get around the island. So you can lose an entire lagoon's worth of breeding waders to foxes overnight. So it's a real challenge, and I'll talk about one of the ways we're going about that in a bit. Now, you can, a lot of reserves are entirely fencing off their sites. So I know the likes of Frampton and places like that have put huge wader fences, and they're very successful, but very expensive. So you've certainly got to fundraise for that. However, that will stop your ground predators, but your avian predators, um, they are much more of a challenge. And a lot of these are widespread in our countryside. Red kites are daily. Buzzards are daily. Sparrowhawks, kestrels, and also you've got the big gulls like lesser blackback and greater blackback gulls, which will be hanging around the lagoons all all summer and around all winter. And I've seen greater blackbacks eating black-headed gull chicks whole on the lagoons, and they are a significant impact to many of our breeding waders. So how can we reduce some of the pressures? Well, one way is to control them. That's not something that we're doing currently. Some reserves do control the fox populations and the corvids, so the crows and the magpies and that. It's not something we're doing. We do at the moment. What we try and do is to reduce the pressure by putting in this case, a wader gate. Although these gates are so big, we think they look a bit like Jurassic Park. So we do call them dinosaur gates. But I'll talk a bit more about that one later. So a very, very keen fox or badger will swim around, but what we hope is that the fence is tall enough and far enough out in the water that the foxes and the like just go somewhere else for food. There is lots of food elsewhere. So this is a predator gate on Lagoon 4, and actually it was really, really beneficial. So we put in really thin gauge mesh there, so then it comes at an angle. So if a fox or similar tries to dig under the fence, it can't do. And then it's a 6-foot tall weld mesh fence, so it's a heck of a jump for species, and obviously like some badgers can't get over it. And it worked very well this year. So cross our fingers that it works well again next year. So you can see that these sort of half round rails, very smooth either side, and things can't jump it very easily at all. So not only are we raising and lower watering levels, but very often we need to do a little bit more. So sometimes we have to clean out the shallow ditches. Top left here there, you can see an excavator cleaning out ditches on the wet meadow. We also need to make sure that we've got the right grass heights for a lot of species as well. So especially redshank, like this sort of tusky grassland. So we're bringing in mowers, cutting the lagoon edges and our wet areas to make sure that it's suitable for our waders. Now that can be wintering waders as well, not just for breeding waders. And we don't cut, obviously, when the breeding season is going. We don't really start cutting our lagoons and our grassland until about middle of September onwards. So it's important for us also to do that grassland management to make sure that the conditions are right for our wintering widgeon, which are feeding on the grassy edges of the lagoons. Now, I mentioned earlier on about the impact that taller trees around the habitat might have on breeding waders as well. So we do quite a lot of willow management and scrub management on the lagoon edges. Now, if you imagine most wading birds will want to see round themselves to make sure that they're safe, and they can't see round themselves if there's tall scrub. And also, if you're a crow, you can just sit on the top of that willow and look down and see where the chicks are running around, see where the eggs are. So it's definitely a lot easier for birds to be predated when you've got tall vegetation around your lagoons. So we make sure that it's open, and control the willow regeneration, which happens very quickly in a wetland habitat. So not only are we doing mechanical methods of making sure that we have the right habitat for waders, so the sward height, the grassland height, but also we're using livestock. So the big difference with the livestock we use is obviously we're using cows and we're using sheep. Now the big difference is that they graze in quite different ways. So cows are very good for breeding waders because they tend to not graze so tightly. What they do is they rip the grass off, and they're also not very keen in feeding around their own feces. So if you look in a field, you'll often see a big cow pat, and they'll leave around it. You'll see these little tussocks that form in that nutrient-enriched area, whilst sheep will graze very, very tight. It's quite difficult for breeding waders to hide their eggs in a very tightly exposed grassy area. So we use cows, particularly in our wet meadows, as the right species for grazing for breeding waders. Now, we've got grassland edge, but we've also got lots of islands, and these pose us with quite a challenge to make sure they're managed correctly for overwintering, for roosting and loafing birds, and also for breeding waders. Rutland Water, as I said earlier on, is a really big reserve. It's 1,000 acres, and we've got some of these islands. You generally can play a game of football or rugby out there. You know, these are big areas, and to go out there with brush cutters is with volunteers is sometimes the islands are just too big. So we've got these snaking islands, so you can drive onto them with machinery. See bottom left there, you've got our AB, which can it's pretty light. It can whiz around and cut the islands. And also we do it by hand as well, the volunteers in the top right there. So if we don't cut it, we're left with these quite woody stems, and really the birds just won't pull out onto these edges and on these islands because they can't see around themselves. They don't know if a buzzard or a peregrine's going to catch them, or if there's a stoat or a weasel hiding in there. So by cutting these islands back, we are making it nice and open, and these birds will be much happier using them to breed, overwinter, and roost on. It's vitally important that we keep these open. And also, we're battling with succession. So we're battling with these islands wanting to turn back into sort of willow carr, into willow woodland. So we're controlling the willow on the islands as well. So on a big wetland reserve like that, like Rutland Water, succession is one of our biggest challenges, because we're always fighting for us to stay open. And you could argue, well, why don't you let it happen? Why don't we just say, okay, let's rewild, let's just stand back, put some big animals on and let it be. There's an argument for that, but I think that the biodiversity would reduce if we did that. We wouldn't have breeding waders. We wouldn't have the birds using the islands and loafing, and the wintering wildfowl numbers would drop. So I think that for us to carry on with the battle against succession, I think is really vitally important for us to maintain the biodiversity across the site. Now, one thing that breeding waders aren't keen on, and any all of our birds really, is disturbance. So we do quite a lot of work to stop that. We've got 35 bird hides on the reserve, and when we're surveying, we use the little hides, as you can see bottom left there, and also when we put in paths, very often we put in banks either side, bottom right there. So when you walk down towards the hide, the birds can't see you coming, or put in screens, as you can see on the hide on the top left. And then when you're in the hide, you get a better view. The birds are not disturbed in the same way. Excuse me. So what Rutland Water is a great big man-made reservoir run by Anglian Water. It's what's the shoreline? 27 miles of shoreline. It is an amazing place for birds to come through on migration, and we're really lucky that we get some great birds on migration and some great waders, which I'll talk about in a moment. But if you're flying, it was always said that if you're a wader or a bird flying across the wash, you can see the glint of Rutland Water in the distance. So if you're flying south, then yeah, there's a stopping point on your flight route. So we can get great numbers of birds coming in. From a wader's perspective, here are some of them. So we get green sandpipers top left. We've got a couple of green sandpipers actually overwintering at the moment. Saw some this week. Sanderling and ruff and dunlin, and green shank, and turnstone, and ring plovers, and common sandpipers, and black-tailed godwits, and bar-tailed godwits, and sometimes we get rare American waders as well. So we're really blessed, and they're wanting to feed on their route to north or south. And we're a little stopover, a little feeding station for them. So we do and try and make sure that we've got some nice muddy edge for them in the spring and in the autumn for them to stock up before they travel on again. And yeah, it's a great place for them on their route. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the work we've done recently to improve the reserve for not just for breeding waders, but we wanted to re-landscape some of the islands on the reserve, primarily to sort of bring the habitat back a step back to where we were. The vegetation starts to dominate, and we also can make our islands a little bit bigger and a little bit flatter. So you can see an island here did have gravel on the island. The edges have got quite willowy there. You can see sort of the willow that's been cut and the tall vegetation. So what we needed to do was to lower these so we could flood them out in the winter more effectively, because we couldn't flood these islands. And this is the sort of thing we were achieving. So with the use of bulldozers and excavators, we've lowered the islands and made them big and flatter. So the birds can see around themselves more easily. They've got more feeding opportunities on the shallow edges. We have a maximum height we can take our water levels to in any of the lagoons. On the new lagoons, that's about 70 centimeters on our gauge boards. Now, that's only important in the respect that when we did our laser leveling, we made sure our islands were roughly about 60 centimeters, so we can flood those out if we want to. And we don't necessarily always want to flood them completely out, but we can do if we want to. So here we have an excavator in the laser level and doing the work on there. So this is the sort of result we've got. This is Lagoon 5. Still lots of muddy open edge, but generally lower, and we can flood them out. Again, similar on Lagoon 5 from this angle as well. We also did Lagoon 4 last winter, and for this one, because it was such a big lagoon, we had to use a bulldozer. And the bulldozer worked away for about 8 days. These are quite expensive bits of kit. We had some funding for this, and the bulldozer is basically pushing the islands out and making them low and flat as the excavator did. And it's surprising how big these islands are when you get working. And again, sort of here, there's this picture of quite a high island again, quite vegetated, and that sharp edge there waders and duck will not be happy stood next to there because they can't see the predators coming. That's why it was so important that we did this work, and that was the result afterwards. There's the VTC in the background, Volunteer Training Centre, so on Lagoon 4. And yeah, sort of much lower and flatter. We had an old guy doing the work. He's certainly done years and years of bulldozing work and new stuff. So yeah, that's my talk on waders. Hopefully you all found that interesting. What we're going to do now is a bit of a Q&A on that. And then I'll do a little talk about the find on Lagoon 4 if anybody wants to stay on. If waders was the thing you wanted to listen to, then that's absolutely fine. But I will be doing a little chat about the sea dragon and our find on Lagoon 4 afterwards.
Thank you, Joe. Sorry.
It's fine. Sorry, I was just getting reconnected. So we've got a few questions actually on the reserve. There was the first question actually on the list was, has the level of protection for the reserve changed since Brexit?
No, it hasn't. Everything remains the same as before Brexit. They haven't made any changes.
Good.
As yet.
And there was a question about the cost of the floating pontoons, and given the high cost of them, have you investigated other alternatives that might allow you to provide more nesting sites, and do other reserves use alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, we have used timber versions in the past, but what we found is that they only last about 4 or 5 years, and we didn't think that was very sustainable. The pontoon islands should last indefinitely, so we should get 30-40 years out of them, and they probably the timber ones probably cost about 1/3 of the plastic pontoon ones. They're UV tolerant, so yeah, we're getting probably 4 times the value for money by doing it that way.
Okay, thank you. And a question on how do you define scrub?
That's a good question. I guess define scrub as a low dense layer of vegetation. So you can have scrub within grassland, you can have a scrubby edge, particularly species such as hawthorn and blackthorn and the like. But yeah, that's a good question.
It is. We've got quite a few questions coming through actually. So a couple of questions that from the same chap actually. Are there breeding woodcock on the reserve, and what management is undertaken for them? And also, what are the prospects for breeding snipe and curlew?
So there's not breeding woodcock. I haven't seen a roading woodcock on the reserve, unfortunately. They do overwinter, so we do get lots in our wet woodland. Snipe, snipe are seeing a northern retraction really, so I think we'd need to see a big change in snipe breeding behavior, as in they're moving south again, because we've got plenty of great habitat for snipe, but they don't seem to be breeding this far south anymore. And then curlew's an interesting one. Lagoon 1 could be a potential location for curlew, and they do breed in the county, but it's only really Lagoon 1 Browns Island area which I could see them breeding in. But they're around and about. We've always got them knocking about. So there's potential, but I can't see it anytime soon.
Okay, and there's a quick question about where are the sand martins located?
Okay, so the San Martin banks are on Lagoon 2. So if you look out from Redshank Hide, there's a really good view of Grebe Hide, and then Lagoon 5. So you can see that from the 360 hide. Really good views of them there. So if you telescopes, binoculars, you can see them flitting around outside the bank. Yeah, you can certainly enjoy them, and they get on with it pretty quickly. So as soon as they're here in March, they'll be in and out those banks. So we've got to make sure that we get the sand in and the holes cleaned out in good time.
Okay, I've still got a few questions if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
One about the type of fencing, which type of fencing on the rafts is most effective?
Yeah, so we try and use, well, it's actually not Perspex, but it's a similar, slightly more UV stable version of Perspex. So everybody can actually see the chicks that are on the, and the birds that are on the islands. So we have historically sometimes used wire to do the same thing, but of course, that's not quite so good because, you know, otters and mink and the like do have claws, so they can sometimes climb up onto them. So we use Perspex just to gain the best view, and it's also very slippy, so it's difficult for them to get for otters to get any purchase on the Perspex.
Okay, another question about when you're reprofiling the islands is, do you know whether much damage is done to invertebrate populations when that's being done?
The fact that they're flooded out mostly anyway, so it's not a stable population of inverts. It'll certainly have an impact, but we're talking about 12-year-old lagoons, so the soils are pretty shallow, you know, there's an impact, but I think the overall outcome is beneficial for you know, for the biodiversity across the site.
Another question about short-eared owls, and do you see many of those?
We used to see a lot of short-eared owls 20 years ago, but not so many. We had a couple reported recently to us, but I'm not so sure that was whether they were short-eared. So no, I mean, you tend to find good years and bad years for short-eared owls. Cossington gets really good numbers sometimes, but you know, great for barn owls, great for tawny owls, little owls as well, but not many short-eared owls.
Okay, and have there been efforts to encourage breeding of bitterns?
We've certainly got some good reed bed, but we need more reed bed to have breeding bitterns. So I forget the hectarage requirement now for UK bitterns, but we could create more reed bed, but we also can never forget the fact that we're a triple SI and an SPA for our breeding and for our overwintering wildfowl. So if we create more reed bed, we've got less open water. And open water is a key element for our triple SI status, for why we've got so many shoveler and gadwall and the like. So, yeah, we can do more work for them, but we'll lose other valuable habitat if we do.
Okay, and I've got a couple more questions. Is there any evidence that grey herons predate the waded chicks?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we've seen the grey herons drop down on the islands and start gobbling stuff up. So there's another culprit for my wall of predators that I showed. I have to put it on my talk for another one. But yes, they certainly do.
Okay. And then do you get many smew? Yep,
we've got smew on site at the moment. So yeah, Ibrook's really good at the moment as well. So there's smew about, redhead and males. So yeah. It can be a brilliant site for smew.
Okay, and one final question, which will lead, I think, into the next section, which is, will the discovery of the Ichthyosaur affect the way that you manage the habitat?
It won't. No, absolutely. And one of the reasons that the Ichthyosaur wasn't taken out of the ground for 7 months is because we had a breeding season, So no, absolutely not. No, we'll make sure that you know, the lagoon is managed as before. There might be a few requests to go and have a look in the area. It's by the paleontologist for a day or something, but nothing more than that.
Okay, and that's all of the questions on the reserve. So I'll come back to you if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And I'll keep a track of questions.
Thank you. So thank you for listening to me talk about Rutland Water Reserve and the breeding waders. But I thought, whilst I was here, and whilst we've had a fairly interesting week and a bit, well, actually about a year, but the last week certainly been very, very full on. I thought I'd talk to everybody a little bit about what we found on Lagoon 4. I'm fairly sure that most of you will have seen the news, and possibly myself guessing about this as well. But back in January, late January last year, colleague and I, Paul Trevor, were walking across with the laser levels. In fact, you saw the picture earlier on of us walking around with a laser level, working out island heights. And I looked down into the mud on Lagoon 4 and could see this this series of ridges. And this is pretty much the picture as we first found them. And these turn out that they were the actual vertebrae of an ichthyosaur, Temnodontosaurus trigodon. And what I thought I could see at the time were these little ridges, these little bits of detail in each of these vertebrae. And we thought possibly it could have been a pipe. There's lots of clay pipes out there. And then Paul walked along a bit further, and the slide on the right here, we thought possibly was a jawbone of something. Now, what do you do if you think you found something like this? And when we realized that it was fossilized and not bone, so, you know, we were sort of thinking, well, it could be a mammoth or a woolly rhino or something along those lines. So I now relatively infamously rang up Rutland County Council and asked who I should speak to if I think I found a dinosaur. They said, well, genuinely, we don't have a dinosaur department, but I will get somebody to get back to you. So I through the Rutland County Council, who were really, really helpful, they put me in contact with this gentleman, Mark Evans, and he came out and was flabbergasted about what they found, or what we'd found, and very quickly said, you know, you've got an ichthyosaur here, and it looks relatively well preserved. What we don't know is whether we've lost the tail or the head. It might have been in the strata at an angle, and we don't have one element of it. But could we come out and have a dig around? And going back to the question that was asked earlier, and I said, yeah, absolutely, but we've got to have the water levels up again soon because we've got breeding waders to think about. Yeah, so they came back in February. So they brought Dean Lomax, who's a national, international expert on ichthyosaurs, and a guy called Neil Larkin, and they they basically started to excavate. Sorry, Nigel said the wrong name. They started to excavate to see what they'd find. And they were astonished to find that when they started digging back towards the tail, which hopefully you can see there is articulated turnaround as it turns around in the mud there, a fully articulated tail in the soft Whitby mudstone. So this is Whitby mudstone. It goes all the way out to the North Sea, this layer of geology. And really what had happened is that they constructed the lagoon, and over time the water and the movement and erosion had sort of exposed just the top of this skeleton, which surprisingly wasn't found during the dig, but I think they must just have missed it by a few inches. And the started to realize quite how big this specimen was. And out came the tape measures, and we thought, goodness me, this thing looks over 8 meters long. And we were starting, they also started to find interesting stuff, which I just pointed here. So this was a tooth. Hopefully you can just see the sort of conical nature of it. Facing sort of the sharp end will be bottom left of the image. And these are the teeth, potentially not of this animal, but of other animals feasting on it. So it really is telling an amazing story, and I think it will tell an amazing story of particularly how it came to its demise. So the paleontologists thought that the conditions were incredibly difficult to work in, which I can imagine, and they said, you know, okay, so you've got breeding waders coming in, you need to get your water levels up. Can we come back later in the summer when things are a bit easier? And COVID precautions were very, very tight then as well. So they came back in July, late July, August, when the breeding season was over. Brilliant season, 30 fledged avocet, so really successful. And started to excavate with a bigger team. So they knew they could only get a couple of people with COVID limitations as they were. So they came back with a much bigger team. So Dean leading it, and started to dig, and found, you know, what none of us could have really, you know, we hoped for and prayed for, but what they found was a fully articulated skeleton. So as you can see here on the bottom picture there, you've got the jawbone jutting out to the right, this the spinal section running all the way down, and starting to see the ribs there as well. So ichthyosaurs have got belly ribs as well, so they've got ribs going all the way down along the body. And then we started to find amazing things like this, the flipper and the picture on the left. So you can see all the detail of each of the little the bones in the flipper there, and then the skull, which there's an awful lot more work to do on that skull. They need to see whether the eye socket's there, whether all the teeth are there. So it's going to be fascinating to what they find out. So here's that flipper and all the ribs starting to be exposed, but the detail, and it was such difficult work. The specimen hadn't fully fossilized in every bit. Some of it was really quite biscuity in its nature, so they had a real challenge in exposing it. But so they did lots of telemetry work. They took thousands and thousands of photos as they worked. And here it is in its locations. This is Lagoon 4, and you can see the scale of it down there. This is a fantastic drone picture. So what they needed to do is they needed to expose it and start to take it away. They couldn't leave it where it was because of frost and damage and erosion. They need to secure this. This is you know, the most intact prehistoric creature of this size ever found in the UK. So they knew they needed to make sure it was safe. So they started to plaster jacket it up. So they put plaster of Paris around it. You can see it on its tail there. And they started to literally take it away in sections. So they dig around it and they dig underneath it. However, part of the issue there is how big it was. So very famous picture this now. Here's Dean, who's about 6'3", lying next to the Ichthyosaur in its full size. So you can see the size of that head. You know, it genuinely probably could swallow one of us whole when it was alive. And there's me. I'm just about 6 foot, and that's the length of the skull there. But that's about a ton's worth of material there. So yeah, they started to jacket it up and take it away in sections. So literally we were there with helping them. So the Nature Reserve staff, Wildlife Trust staff were helping them with tractors and trailers and telehandlers and the like. And these are huge sections to plaster up and take away. And they had real problems. We had, for August, we had really cold, damp northerly winds. I sound surprised, but yeah, August can often have some funny weather, can't it? They had a real struggle in the actual plaster setting. Like they'd never experienced it before. But eventually the winds turned a bit, and we were lifting the sections whole using telehandlers. Here, there's me driving telehandler. It's a very nerve-wracking thing to know that you've got a ton of Ichthyosaur skull at your right hand with the controls there, just praying that nothing goes wrong and you don't drop it. But thankfully, it all went well, and we brought it back, and it's now in secure storage in Shropshire, ready to be worked on. There you go. So you can see the plaster. What they had to do is to make this framework around it as well, to make sure it didn't collapse. And there's Nigel's storage there. Before that went in, there was a T-Rex that he was working on. The next step is for all to be worked on. It's going to take about a year, but also they need to secure funding. So it's over £100,000 to do this work. It's over a year's worth of work for a small team to clean it all up and see what secrets that this animal holds. You know, there might be ichthyosaurs gave birth to live young, so you know it could be young if it was a female. We'll see what happens when we look at the skull. Will there be teeth, etc. So there it is in storage with a life-size banner above it. So there it is in its sections ready to be worked on. So yeah, just a little bit about what ichthyosaurs are. So they're a marine reptile. They were around from about 250 million years ago. The one that we found is roughly 180 million years old. And they really, I guess they look like a dolphin, a very large dolphin with a shark's tail. So the tail goes sideways as opposed to up and down like with a dolphin. They were the apex predator of their time. They were the biggest creature in the sea and probably bigger than most creatures on land as well. So this one was a Temnodontosaurus, so Greek for cutting tooth lizard. And have I missed anything out? Yeah, it could grow up to 12 meters long. Nearest one found is in Germany. Different Temnodontosaurus found by Mary Anning famously. Yeah, the biggest eye of virtually any animal known for its size, which meant that it would have been diving down to great depths to see creatures, you know, low in the low light level zone in the seas. And yeah, it's been an incredible journey. It's been really interesting to learn so much about them. Yeah, the next steps will be what happens when we start looking at the mud that Whitby, you know, that mudstone around it, and see what lessons and see what we find.
Thanks, Joe. There's not many questions coming up on the chat, but I've got a couple actually. Do you know how much the total weight of the ichthyosaur was after it was removed? Or whilst it was
it's probably roughly about 3 tons, I should think.
Yeah, so no mean feat then getting that out.
No, it's an amazing. The paleontologists did an amazing job of extracting it. They did, yeah. The real challenges along the way with things not setting and the like. Yeah, it was a team effort, and they did really well.
There is a question actually about whether you think there's likely to be any more excavations.
I don't think so. No, I mean, you know, maybe at some point in the future, something will open. We might see something, but it's a very unusual find. It'd be very unusual to find something like that again. You know, it's 1,000,000 to 1 shot. But, you know, never say never. And we'll certainly, you know, be probably having a look once a year when the levels are low enough. But also we need to be careful that that other people don't look as well, and you know, we don't want any issues with disturbance out there. So we'll be locking the gates and making sure that we don't get illegal access out there, because you know, we could end up with issues with the, you know, with the living wildlife there. So yeah, we'll be cautious.
Okay, just one final question. I don't know, you might not know the answer to this, but do you think there's anywhere in Rutland or Leicestershire that might be able to host it when the work's complete?
Yes, an interesting question. I hope that it will come back to the county. I think there's a real desire for it to come back to county. Certainly, Alicia Kearns, our MP, is really driving for that. She, you know, she was saying that it needed to raise money at Prime Minister's questions about it last week. I think there's a massive amount of interest. Certainly, speaking to some school kids and school groups that are coming forward, that, you know, the next generation are utterly fascinated with it, as are this generation. But I think that there could be a real scope for displaying it in Rutland. You know, whether it's in a museum or whether it's a specific building created for it and displayed somewhere around Rutland Water, that'd be fantastic as well. But who knows? There's nothing's been sorted, but that's a lot of it will depend on funds and finance and the like.
Just one final question, actually, that's just popped up. Will there be any information at Rutland Water at the visitor centres about the Ichthyosaur?
Yeah, so I think we'd like to get some interpretation up in the birdwatching centre. So we may well be able to get one of the banners. You saw that life-size banner that we could display there. So hopefully we'll get something in the not too distant future to give everybody a bit more information about it.
Excellent. That's all the questions. So I'll just hand over to Anthony.
Thanks very much, Becky, and thank you very much, Joe. It's been a superb evening, learning about how you're developing the areas for waders, and then culminating in this story about the Ichthyosaur. It's just so amazing that these wetland areas were a lot wetter and over 200 million years ago. And thanks very much. I know everybody's been really glued to news bulletins and what you can read about over the last week. It's a fascinating story. Also fascinating anyway that the reserve is doing so well, particularly for numbers of waders and other species on top. Over the last 40 years, that reserve is just an incredible development, and it's been great to be sort of almost part of it, really, from the time of the first digger that went in over 40 years ago. Thank you very much indeed, Joe. It's been brilliant, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joe. Anyone who's still listening, make sure to head to our website for our next online talks. We've got lots more lined up over the next few months. And of course, make sure to keep following our social media and the Rutland Water social media for updates about the sea dragon, and we'll make sure to keep posting things on there. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.